My name is Christine Kirkpatrick. I'm at the San Diego Supercomputer Center, where I am Division Director of Research Data Services. And I'm really delighted to have several colleagues here today who are helping wrangle data and collaborate with other people who are trying to help us fight COVID-19. And what they have in common is they are all trying to figure out how to integrate messy data together, or to use big words, heterogeneous data. So with that, let me just give you a little more background on our webinar series. So this is the last but not least of the 4-part series. We started out with an introduction to the virus outbreak data network, where we had Professor Dr. Baron Mons. Then the next week we had Professor Dr. Mirjam van Rijzen talk about VODA in Africa. And we will actually have another webinar series launching about that, but I'll say more at the end. Then last week we had 2 presentations. We saw VODAN in action. We had Albert Mons and Luis Bonino talk about that. And then we had kind of a database of databases from the University of California, San Francisco, where Sergio Baronzini and Sharad Israni demonstrated that. And I'll have a link at the end of this full webinar again, so that you can, if you missed last week, you know how to go and find it. And so with that, let me turn the controls over to Peter Rose. Okay, and now you should be able to share, Peter. Dr. Peter Rose is the director of the Structural Bioinformatics Laboratory at SDSC. Since joining SDSC in 2007, his group built the RCSB Protein Databank to its current strength as a key resource in biology and drug discovery. He currently works on NIH-funded Big Data to Knowledge projects to enable large-scale mining of 3D macromolecular structures. Prior to joining UCSD, he held research and management positions at Pfizer La Jolla, formerly Agoron Pharmaceuticals, where he was instrumental in the establishment of the structure-based drug design platform. And he is also going to be joined by Ilya Zaslavsky, who he partners with, who is the director of Spatial Information Systems Laboratory at UC San Diego. His research focuses on distributed information management systems, in particular on spatial and temporal data integration, geographic information systems, and spatial data analysis. Ilya has been leading design and technical development in several cyber infrastructure projects, including the National Scale Hydrologic Information System, which develops standards, databases, and services for integration of hydrologic observations. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Christine. I mean, as you heard from the introduction, Ilya and myself, we have very different backgrounds, so it's obvious that, we're trying to integrate very different types of data here. So we are part of an NSF effort called the CONVERGENCE Accelerator, and they basically want to harness, the big data revolution. And one of the tracks we are on called the Open Knowledge Network, and here the idea is to integrate heterogeneous data. And COVID-19 was, I think, a nice example of that. More specifically about our project, it's called CONQUER, and the idea here is to bridge 3 disciplines: the bio-health science discipline, geoscience, anything that has a geolocation, and climate science. And this effort is based on existing systems. On the bio side, we have a system called DataMed. It was developed through NIH grants. And the idea here is to create an index for data set. It's like the PubMed for what PubMed is for publication is DataMed for data sets. So it contains about 2.3 million bio-related data sets. So the search engine to find data sets. On the other hand, on the geoscience side, we have an effort by Ilya called Data Discovery Studio. It's a very similar effort, but now it's focused on geoscience, plus we have climate science data. So this is a collaboration between UC San Diego, University of Texas Health, and NCAR. But specifically, part of this NSF Open Knowledge Network, there are multiple teams involved. So last week, you heard from Sergio Baranzini about the effort at UC San Francisco that's represented in this orange color here. They focus on the biomedicine area. We have collaborators too in UC Santa Barbara in green here, and in blue, this is UC San Diego in blue. So you see, those are different aspects of COVID-19, having population statistics, health data, biomedical data, information about virus strains, environmental factor, and infrastructure. And so we have a loose collaboration among those three teams. And the idea is that we create a knowledge graph, and that knowledge graph would then enable new forecasts, new models, and dashboards. So, I mean, this is an example of, heterogeneous data. Here we have travel data, we have genome sequences, we have protein structures, we have potential drug molecules. How do we link this together? So the way we think about COVID data is basically there are three big categories. One is the host, that's generally the patient, or it can also be an animal like a bat who is a reservoir potentially for COVID. On the host side, we have patient data, then we have the pathogen, and here we have data about host pathogen interactions, about genome information like the strains, previous outbreaks, and then everything else fits into what we call environment. It has to do with travel, weather, and so forth, all the factors that are involved here. So we're trying to link those type of data together. So here's an early attempt that I actually did in January, where COVID wasn't as much of a problem here, but to just show you how we can connect different data. On the left-hand side in yellow and orange, those are different cities, states, and countries where there are outbreaks. In the middle, in green, those are the different strains of the viruses. And there now you see their lines connecting them to specific locations here. And then on the right-hand side, we have more the biological data like genomes, genes, and proteins. So here we have a gene, here we have a genome that has genes, that has proteins. I mean, this is just, the beginning of a larger network where we can connect things together. Now, how can we use that information? So here's one specific example here. So in panel D, those are persons, they came from Brazil, they visited Italy, and they got infected in Italy with a particular type of strain labeled A2A. So they brought this strain back to Sao Paulo and then spread that in the community. So in C, this is community spread. You see that same type of strain being spread. So this viral information basically helps us trace where those viruses may have come from. And then interestingly, this strain also showed up in San Francisco as well as here locally in San Diego. Now then we can link this to other information we have available. So this was just an early attempt to represent this in a knowledge graph. So we also started a crowdsourcing project where we take data from the community, where we depend on community expertise. We're collecting heterogeneous data set, and we are not necessarily the expert in those areas. So we need expertise. We need obviously data sets. We need tools to process the data sets, clean them up, and then build a knowledge graph out of this. And once we have that knowledge graph, we can then hopefully more easily create any kind of infographics and visualization out of that, such as dashboards, run analysis on the data, and as well as create forecasts. So this project is still in the very early stages at this point. So we wanted to have a workflow that's reproducible. So if we get contribution from the community, we don't just want to get a file of data and we don't really know where it came from and how it was cleaned up. So rather what we want to do is we want it be based on open access data, on open data that are freely available. Then we want users to create, for example, Jupyter notebooks, since they're very popular for data science and cleaning up data. We don't want a hand manipulated data. We want an automated workflow that takes the original data, massages the data, and then, for example, creates flat files, for example, in the form of CSV files. that we can then upload into a knowledge graph. So the idea is the community will provide Jupyter notebooks that download data, clean the data, and then we can integrate them into a knowledge graph. So to make it, as simple as possible. So one question that comes up in terms of FAIR is interoperability for knowledge graphs. And one way to do that is using queries. Those are compact URLs, basically, where you have an identifier that links to a persistent URL, and that persistent URL then links to the URL by the provider, which may change over time here. So as an example, here's an NCBI protein. We have a prefix, the NCBI protein : and then comes the identifier. So therefore we know the provenance, where this comes from. And then using services like identifiers.org, we can put in this query, this abbreviation, and resolve it. So that will actually then link to the specific protein we're talking about. And this kind of ideas come out of a model called BioLink. So BioLink came up with the idea to use those type of identifiers in knowledge graphs. Just an example for SARS proteins here, we have different genes, we have different proteins, and each node in this graph has an ID in it, and that enables us to link to other knowledge graphs. So here we say the ID is an NCBI gene, and that's the session number. Similarly, this protein actually has 2 different names from 2 different organizations, one from UniProt, one from NCBI. By going back to identifiers.org, we can figure out what is it, and we can go back to the exact data set here. Another thing we are doing in our knowledge graph, we provide MD5 hashes, which is a hash code of the actual sequences. So this allows us to link, for example, protein or gene sequences that are identical, but in terms of the identifier, we would not necessarily know that they are the same. And with that, so I focus more on the biomedical part, and now I have Ilya talk about other types of data that we're integrating here.
Yeah, just a couple additional aspects that we need to look at when we develop a knowledge graph. One is obviously that location is often the only way how we can connect data, how we can relate data about COVID-19 with social, economic, and demographic characteristics, and weather patterns, and climate data. But this is often tricky, and these issues are actually quite familiar to everybody who work with spatial data. Locations can be referenced in multiple different ways. The quality of assigning locations varies across different data sets. We have different types of location census geographies and zip codes and hydrologic unit codes. And ideally, we would need to standardize such location identifiers so that we can connect information from multiple sources into a knowledge graph. We have, as part of Data Discovery Studio, a spatial enhancer that we applied to all data records with mixed success, I would say, because the types of heuristics that we have for geoscience data don't quite work for data metadata. So that would require some additional work. So, and essentially we're trying to organize the multiple tools that we develop, including geocoders and geonames source, into a pipeline that would assign such locations unambiguously. Next slide. Another issue is how we can expose information, how we can take advantage of the information about COVID that is published on the web. A week ago, Office of Science and Technology Policy issued that directive to federal agencies to incorporate schema.org markup in COVID web pages that they publish. That would essentially allow search engines and applications to directly connect to the web pages and get this data into a search index or into applications, and that would actually be very useful because we'll not have to write scrapers anymore, and we'll be able to use a common vocabulary for that. We do have, and by the way, this directive mentions open knowledge network projects as kind of the force behind developing the markup, or potential group of people who would help with that. Next slide. We have some experience doing that on the geoscience side. For example, if you go to Google Dataset search and type in any terms that would be related to geosciences, chances are that you will get Data Discovery Studio as one of the first sources that provide this information. So in that case, you type in air quality, and like for the first three would reference Data Discovery Studio. Because we convert all records that we have into schema.org markup and let Google register that. So with this experience, next slide, we are now trying to use the new extensions of schema.org to mark up COVID web pages, and that's just one example from San Diego County that publishes case counts. At the moment, we get this data via scrapers, but ideally we would have this data, the schema.org markup embedded in such web pages. Next one. And of course, building a knowledge graph and large-scale efforts like that will require a lot of free labor. So Peter and I run a course on exploring COVID-19 pandemic. That's a workshop-style course where students work on projects, and these projects are related to developing dashboards and figuring out population at risk to COVID, and creating some components of the subgraph of the knowledge graph related to location and protein-protein interactions, and also developing schema.org markup recommenders, where you would parse the content of the web page, recommend the markup, and then take users' input as to whether this markup is correct and learning from that. Next one. Yeah, that's just a general overview of how these dashboards work, and knowledge graph is an important component of that. So we get data via scrapers, so from datasets that we have registered, automatically create feature services, and update feature services to update the maps. And from these maps, we can further query the knowledge graph and figure out what additional data we need to integrate based on location. So this is not yet working, but we're building components of that system. And next slide, I think this is the last one. Since Peter mentioned at the beginning that we work with several groups who develop different components of the knowledge graph, and there are knowledge graphs about COVID that appear everywhere. So we can now start thinking about how to make knowledge graphs fair. Basically, if we can have a registry of such knowledge graphs where we can find them, how they would be accessed in a standard manner, what would make knowledge graphs interoperable, a set of persistent IDs, queries, and what would make them reusable. And here we may want to think about a common vocabulary such as provided by schema.org or other extended vocabularies similar to those that are developed in the Science on Schema project. This slide is mostly for discussion, and that's where we stop.
Thank you so much, Peter and Ilya. We have time for one quick question. We'll also have questions at the end, but if anyone has a burning question, feel free to mention it quickly. Ilya and Peter, I have a quick question. Have you seen anything so far? I saw a lot of maps of San Diego County. Any interesting hints about how things are going from what you've seen, or it's okay if you don't want to say? You're amongst friends.
Well, if you're referring to case counts by zip codes or by cities or by census tracts, this information is not very reliable because of the intricacies of testing and policies with respect to testing. But some pictures do emerge, such as southern San Diego has higher rates of growth in a number of cases, for example, and we can now relate cases to a number of risk factors that are, such as lung cancer and asthma, hypertension, and other types of health indicators by census tracts. So this is part of data science analysis that we're trying to do.
And if I could ask a follow-up question, to what extent are a lot of those maps dependent on zip codes? Because we know many places in the world don't have, a zip code structure. Could this be used and adapted for other addressing schemes or lack thereof?
In other countries, we may have to deal with whatever administrative units they have, and geonames and other systems have these more or less well described. So most likely in other countries will go to the level of provinces, states, but it depends because it's very diverse, of course.
Yes, you bring up a good point about the public's interest in exactedness, if that's a word, and precision. And some of these things are very difficult, if not sometimes irresponsible, to try and quantify at that level of precision. So thank you so much, and please do stick around for questions at the